So two high-profile visits by European statesmen to India in just the last couple of weeks. We first had the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz come to India, talk about a range of issues from trade to defense to technology. And now we have the President of Spain, one of the first visits in 2 decades by the Spanish Premier in happening today. The Indian Prime Minister as well as the Spanish President unveiling a facility to manufacture C-295 transport aircraft, which is another milestone in the history of Indian aerospace. So really just a flurry of visits from top European leaders, and it brings us to ask some questions about India's engagement with Europe, why we're seeing these high-level visits over the last couple of weeks and months. And joining me now to explain that is Ummu Bava, who has been a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and who has been a crucial part of the Center for European Studies there. Professor Bava, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you to begin by explaining the significance of these two visits by the German Chancellor and by the Spanish President?
Thank you, Shashank, for having me on the show. I think what you see in these two back-to-back visits is to situate it in a larger geopolitical and geoeconomic context, and the fact that at this point in time there are two major wars going on, one in Europe, in Ukraine, and the other in the Middle East, in Gaza. And I think in that context, if you situate the visit, they acquire a very different meaning. The first visit of the German Chancellor, which is just concluded, on Friday, emphasized, of course, ongoing Indo-German relations, the fact that there's a strategic partnership, and in 2025, it's coming up to actually 25 years of it. So I think what we see is it's a headline visit because Germany has also put out a new Focus on India document, which draws attention to upgrading the partnership. On the other hand, the ongoing visit of the Spanish, premier, president of the government, is also indicative of, again, India's engagement with Europe and expanding the strategic quotient in the partnership we have with both these European countries. The takeaways in both the visits are different. At the same time, there is a converging point, because we have to remember that both these countries are also members of the European Union, with whom India is at this point also negotiating a free trade agreement, an investment agreement, and a geographical indicators agreement.
Understood. Professor, if I could ask you in terms of what changed in the India-Europe relationships. I think that at one point in time, of course, it could be said that for Europe, I remember I was in Brussels earlier this year, and they said that, a decade ago, China was really the big focus. And now we see a much more concerted effort to engage with India, to see what can be done with India. What really changed in the European outlook on India that we've seen this increased engagement both at the EU level as well as on the individual national level?
So at the European level, I think, there's a new commission coming in, but von der Leyen, when she was the commission president earlier in her previous term, had also spoken about a geopolitical commission. And let's not forget, in 2019, the commission came out with a document on China, which identified it both as, it's a partner, it's a competitor, and a systemic rival, thereby really transforming that, engagement with China. And let's not forget, China is the world's largest manufacturer, but it's also the largest trading partner for many countries, including Europe or the European Union and India as well. Coupled with that is also the fact that the Indo-Pacific region has become far more strategically important, also drawing attention to both what we're seeing over there, the competition, the contestation, and increasingly also, a lot of issues about the rules of engagement in that. And clearly in all of this, the ramping up in the bilateral relationship has taken place. One also needs to bear in mind that the India-EU relationship is also been slowly maturing. We are now looking again, in the case of the India and EU, also at 25 years of a strategic partnership, which was launched in 2004. So I think, you're kind of seeing the convergence of not only geopolitical factors, geoeconomic shifts, which is brought to bear China's weight on the global supply chains, and why de-risking has become important, not only as a buzzword, in the Indo-Pacific, but also appears in the European Union, and why then part of that gets visible in the India push, which is coming from Europe at present.
Right. And two major countries, of course, both their leaders coming to India. And one of the key focus areas was defense. We know that both Germany and Spain are bidding for the Indian Navy's contract to build 6 new air-independent propulsion submarines. Could you talk a little bit about the shift in strategic thinking on India working with more European powers for its defense needs, for its defense requirements? At one point in time, of course, we've seen over just the last couple of weeks some conversations or reports about Indian defense equipment finding its way into Europe and into Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about this defense relationship that's spun up between India and Europe?
So I think what you're seeing is also a consequence of other political developments, and how India has sought to expand and diversify its defense suppliers. One has to keep in mind that one can't just add on partners to it. There are numerous bilateral issues, but there are also conditions within each of these countries on with whom they can actually do a defense trade or cannot do, or even to that matter, where we're now looking at is production and development. So I think it's a very welcome development you see. In the case of Germany, of course, there have been domestic constraints which seem to have now, been ironed out. And Germany, in its recent India Focus document, has, put out that it would want to be a strong partner in defense for India, somebody which can sustain the relationship. And in the case of Spain, already that partnership has seen the edge, because 2 years back, the investment was made on the C295 aircraft, assembly line over here. And what you saw in the inauguration take place was actually the rollout of that first aircraft. So I think we are seeing in the partnership with Europe, this emphasis on defense, which has long been there in the background, which has been filled out by some of the countries. France, for example, Spain takes a lead also over here. Now taking on a new age of partnership in the defense relationship. There's a maturing, which also is looking at India, not only as an end user of this, but India has also emphasized critically that India would want to co-design, co-develop, and produce over here, and then also be available for third countries. So I think there is a quantum shift happening in the defense sector as a consequence of the shift in the trust quotient in the relationship.
Right. Professor Bava, could I also ask you perhaps to talk a little bit about, these emergent conversations in India talking about how, closer defense partnerships with European countries that would come here, manufacture here, will also allow India to up its defense exports back to Europe at some point in time, given that the continent is looking to expand its own defense production, its own sources of defense supply, given the war in Ukraine and the fact that many national militaries in Europe are finding that they are simply not as well prepared as they would like to be to fight this conflict. Do you see this as a possibility that India could, of course, use European technology and build these partnerships into something where India could also export to Europe at some point in the future?
I think that that is definitely on the table. It cannot be closed out. It all depends then finally on those individual defense deals that one would have to look at. Even if you take the case of now the C295, after the domestic requirements are met, there is the provision for the end of line assembly over here and export to third countries, based again on whatever contractual points are there within that bilateral agreement. So I think it's a very important element. It supports the Make in India campaign. It also supports what India has strongly been arguing about, that if you have a partnership of this nature, trust is extremely crucial. And the transfer of technology is one issue on which very often there has been the issue of trust. Would that technology stay with India, or would that be jeopardized in some way? And I think India has given enough evidence, be it on the non-proliferation sector as well, that how we will stay firm to our commitments. So I do see a new era in the India-Europe relations, and I think in the long term there is this possibility that weapons made in India would also, meet some of the requirements for Europe.
Right. And Professor, if I could ask you, just more specifically on this slightly thorny question of reports that we've seen come out in the last couple of weeks and months about Indian weapons finding their way into Ukraine. Do you think that has been a cause of concern for India? There have been some conversations that the Indian government is sort of looking the other way when something like this is happening. Could I ask you, does something like this damage strategic trust when it comes to defense? Would India have made its concerns known? Should these reports turn out to be accurate on Indian weapons finding their way into Ukraine?
So I think there's very strict controls on end user use and how those weapons are. Each one is identifiable, marked, and shipped. Um, so unless there is a very specific case about a weapon having or a consignment having gone wrong, it would be very difficult for weapons to end up in the other than designated supplier. So one would then have to see what kind of actionable evidence is presented. Second, if there is any such issue, then steps have to be taken to find out where such where the system has broken down, where the possibility took place for such a weapon to get out of it, and then third, to plug the loophole. So I think between in a wartime situation like this, one will find also all kinds of claims being made out, and I think it's important that when the government will respond, it won't be on hearsay unless there is actionable evidence to such.
Understood.
So let us keep that in mind, given the kind of the optics of it, because it does. If they're just merely optics, then the attempt is to put India on the back foot, and India has been taking a very strong diplomatic stand on the war in Ukraine.
Right. Professor, this allows us a good segue into something that has been something of a strategic question between India and Europe over the last couple of years, which is the war in Ukraine. How, you've probably spoken a lot to, European diplomats, people in the European Union. As I said personally, I've been to Brussels as well, and time after time and meeting after meeting, the question was, look, we understand your position on Ukraine, but we would like you to still do something more to sympathize with our position, because for the European continent, this is an absolutely existential question. Could I ask you, where exactly is the state of play on Ukraine? Do you believe that it has damaged strategic trust between India and Europe, or have both sides largely settled their differences on this question? Is it a settled issue? Because many in Europe are now talking about how perhaps Ukraine might also need to be heading for a negotiated peace settlement. Do you see this the strategic salience of this question on Ukraine going down in the future? Has it already dissipated in some senses? Could you help us make sense of that?
Yeah, so I think if you put it in context, Shashank, then it's more than 2 years since the war is going on, almost in a stage of sometimes grabbing headlines, and then there is another war happening, which is equally grabbing headlines. So what is playing out from the initial point when it started on 24th of February 2022 to where we are today? I think in terms of the political decisions which have been taken, and in terms of the relations between India and Europe, I think we've covered quite a lot of territory. From a European perspective, it is understandable given the long years where they've not seen any major war on the continent. A war in Ukraine is at their border, and that notion of the existential is something which is extremely new to them. From an Indian perspective, given the kind of border management we've been having to deal with since 47, war is not a word which is tucked away into a history book. For us, it's extremely real. It's extremely part of managing the border every day. And I think to that extent, there has been a different sense of perception in Europe about understanding India's own geopolitical compulsions on an everyday basis. Europe has had the luxury of time to deal with a lot of its borders.
Right.
We've never had that. And second, I think India has made its position very clear, that how it has its relations with different countries. It would have to look at each of these relations within the scope of that partnership. It cannot be from the lens of the interest of another country or another partner. I think that message is communicated clearly very well to Europe. Europe has also understood. And let's not forget, in the initial days, it was presented merely as a conflict between democracies and autocracies. And that kind of binary has not gone down very well in our part of the world, to recognize that if that was the mere lens, then a lot of Europe's own engagements with countries whom they label like that will not stand to scrutiny. So I think in our bilateral relationship, I would say that we have turned the corner on that. We recognize, and External Affairs Minister has very clearly pointed out that Europe's problem cannot be the world's problem, and they turn a blind eye to what is happening elsewhere.
Right.
So I think we've turned the corner on that. There's a better appreciation of each other's geography of exposure to threats. And I think that is why we also see that there is a new infusion in the bilateral relationship, which is also visible. I would emphasize here for the viewers is visible in the kind of bilateral track we're seeing. So not only in the India EU, we see that, but see Prime Minister's recent visits to Poland, to Austria. He's also been to Ukraine, and more recently the visit by the German Chancellor and the Spanish President. That also indicates that we're not looking at it from the lens of 2022. I think that's extremely important. There's a reality check on both sides that is bringing about a far more strategic engagement between Europe and India.
Right. Professor, one of the key questions that comes up when you're talking about India and Europe is that, India is soon to be moving towards becoming the third largest economy in the world. Europe, the European Union, of course, is an absolutely massive economic bloc with a great deal of economic influence. But the problem seems to be that their trade agreement that was much talked about, the India-EU free trade agreement, seems to have stalled. Do you have any sense on when you have those conversations about trade, economic frictions between the two countries when it comes to Europe thinking that India is protectionist, India thinking that Europe is asking for too much? Where do you see the middle line on something like this?
So I think if you look at the India-EU relationship and the fact that this is our second round at negotiating a trade agreement, and this time we're looking at three very specific agreements: a trade agreement, investment agreement, protection agreement, and a geographical indications agreement. And I think it's a welcome development that not all of them are being put together into one basket, as was the case previously. I think there is optimism, and at the same time, one has to recognize that the trade agreements are extremely complex, and even as we speak, there have been numerous political and economic developments, which means in all these rounds of 9 negotiations have taken place, it's probably reached a point where one would have to see that now it has to go beyond the bureaucracy or the negotiators who are there around the table, and probably bring the political pressure or the political impulse which will have to come from the top to see that we can move towards culmination. So I think some of those points which you said about India being India standing on certain things, the Europeans demanding certain things, I think there is a certain element of reality to it. But beyond that perception check, I think where is the reality? Both sides want to move. I think you've seen again in the latest statements by both the German Chancellor and the Spanish President of the government, both emphasizing on the free trade agreement and the India-EU relations. So I think there is a sense of urgency. India has also negotiated a few, for example, with EFTA countries, we've got a trade agreement, but it's a smaller group. And I think our negotiations are far more complex. So I think probably with the commission coming into office by end of the year, one is hopeful that 2025 will bring not only a summit, but also some movement, at least on these 3 different agreements that we are negotiating with the European Union.
Professor Ummu Bava, thank you so much for your time explaining to us the 2 visits that we've had by top European statesmen, where the India-EU relationship is right now, and also some of the friction and tension points between India and its European partners. Thank you, Professor, again for your time, and thank you so much, viewers, for watching India Today Global.